is that almost all of these deconversion stories end with people declaring how free they feel after they've escaped.
So welcome to another Prepared to Answer podcast. So pleased to have Scott back. How are you?
Hi, Shawn. Good to be back. Good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks. And so today's podcast is we're actually going to leap off of our last podcast with Matt, and we're hoping our listeners have listened. It was a great episode with Scott and Matt, our new apologist with True Snack, and their discussion on doubt. And what we thought we would do is maybe back up a little bit. And again, we'd encourage you to listen to that episode about doubt. If you're doubting, if you know someone that is doubting, it's a great episode to start with.
And it's great to listen to, Shawn, because Matt's got a great story. Like, that's his story, right? Yeah. Growing up in the church, growing up a faithful Christian, and then having this crisis of doubt, and then moving through it. And one of the gifts God's given to him is this story of moving through doubt to a place of confident faith.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like he said, and you'd have to listen to it, he's not 100% sure of everything, but I love the line that he's confident.
Right.
He's a confident Christian. And so, again, we'd encourage you to listen to that. But I thought today, Scott, we could maybe back up a bit and maybe take one step back from doubt and maybe talk about one of the seeds that may cause people to doubt.
Okay.
And what we thought we could talk about today are what seems to be a lot of deconversion stories, or sometimes it's termed deconstruction stories. And that could be a seed of doubt to someone, that they've seen someone famous, a Christian, maybe written books, sold millions, or a YouTube star that they know as a Christian and has now come out and said that they've deconverted or that they no longer believe in the faith. And so for what could be a lot of young people, that could be very troubling as they're developing their faith, to hear someone they've respected and listened to and followed to say they don't believe that anymore. And then that could start a path of doubt, a journey of doubt. So, Scott, I thought maybe we could start with maybe some common themes with these stories, with these deconversion stories.
Sure. And maybe it's worthwhile putting into context before we do that, Shawn, it seems to be that deconversion stories are suddenly emerging. And there's a lot of, I'm seeing a lot of conversation and concerns being expressed online among Christians that, it's all of a sudden there's this trend in deconversion. Is something new going on? Is there a crisis taking place that has never happened before? What's going on? And I think we'll get to this in a bit, but I don't necessarily think there's anything particularly new going on. As I was reading one writer on the Gospel Coalition talked about it, it's as if there's a new genre of story being told because of, in large part, because of social media. And as you said, it seems like there are so many celebrity Christians coming out and telling their deconversion story, but it's almost formed a new social media genre. And I think because of that, people feel like something new has happened. But in the end, it's not ultimately new, but I think there are some unique things taking place in these stories that are worth discussing. And so, getting to the discussion about themes. So what's interesting, there's a book I read by John Marriott on analyzing deconversion. And John, he's a professor down at Biola University, but he did his PhD studying deconversion stories. And he polled and interviewed hundreds of Christians or people who formerly were Christians. And he did, as he went through, he kind of, he said it's very difficult to say what's the cause of deconversion, but he did identify a number of themes. And even pointing back to our discussion with Matt, there are really two themes that Matt brought up. And here were the two common themes that he found in deconversion stories, that they often break into really two kinds. There's the emotional theme, that people who've left Christianity because of disappointments with church leadership, or people, public leading figures who have somehow greatly disappointed, like a moral failing of a highly respected Christian spokesperson. And then there's a moral failure, and there's this deep disillusionment and disappointment. How could such a person, right, have, been so duplicitous and turned from their faith? Or even emotional hurts that people have experienced personally. The other side of it are really the intellectual reasons. People who struggle with what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, that there's this break in thinking that they can't maintain a train of thinking any longer because there's a breakdown in the reasoning that supports what they used to believe. Marriott actually identifies what he would say the three most significant intellectual reasons, which I think was very interesting, and maybe our listeners can identify with this. But the three, I'm sure there's more than three, but here were the three main ones. The number one reason was perceived problems with the Bible.
Right.
And I think we're seeing that more and more. There's a lot more discussion right now on doubting the truth of the Bible, the inerrancy of the Bible, things like that. Yeah. The second was Darwinian evolution. Christians who have maybe been raised in the church, taught a particular model of Earth history based on a particular interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. And then they go into the secular academia's field, and they're introduced to the evidence from Darwinian evolution, and it just completely blows them apart.
Right.
And then the last is the direct influence of atheists, and particular atheists with a really strong deconversion story. And it's interesting that many of the most vocal kind of atheists are people who've come out of a quote-unquote Christian upbringing, right, and have a very strong deconversion story. And they almost become evangelists for atheism to try, and their mission becomes reversed from a Christian mission where we want to declare the truth of Jesus. They want to declare the truth of atheism and help people escape from the lie. And I'm using, you can't see on the podcast, but I'm using the quotes with my fingers, the lie of Christianity. Right. So I thought that was interesting, but that really does parallel what Matt described in our last podcast about the difference between emotional doubt and intellectual doubt.
Right. So when you talk about the emotional and the intellectual doubts, is it one or the other, or could it be a combination?
Yeah, and again, it's interesting anytime you analyze something as complicated as what motivates people, to move from one belief system to another, and you realize that while we might classify stories as a particular kind of story, every person is different. So you can never just say it's one thing or they're this type versus this type, and those are two, absolute types. Right. I think what I've witnessed from just listening to and hearing people describe their stories of deconversion or faith deconstruction, and even the ones I've read, it's always a mixture.
Of both.
Of both. Yeah. I mean, God's made us, body, spirit, soul, mind. You can't bisect our emotions from our intellect. Right. So there's always a combination. What I found really interesting from Marriott's book, however, and nothing surprising me here, but it's always good to hear someone who's actually done the research. He admits that, the causes are complex. The stories are complex. Right. So you can't ever just point to one thing, but he did recognize or identify in the hundreds of stories he heard, he identified some common themes, which I thought were very interesting. And let me just, Shawn, I'll just list the three themes that he mentions and then maybe unpack them a bit. Sure. The first that he identified was in the stories that he collected were aspects of fundamentalism. And maybe I'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of kind of the flavor of the church that they came out of was more fundamentalist in its culture and in its belief set. That all of these stories, there was in their story background a high commitment level. That these were not just nominal church, attenders who kind of came on Christmas and Easter sort of thing. These were people who were highly engaged. And then the last was people identifying that even in their Christian commitment, they were continually struggling with problems with Christianity, even while being a Christian. There were things they struggled with in their faith beliefs, even while they were committed. Right. So what's interesting is, just go back to talking about aspects of fundamentalism. Here's what that means. In terms of a fundamentalist kind of culture, there were three things that he identified. One was a high emphasis on taboos. Okay. So in a more fundamentalist background, the real emphasis was on, here's the kind of things that we don't do as Christians, right? Here's the kind of things that a Christian would never buy this or have this in their home, and a true Christian would never believe in this, right? Yeah. So it was a very negative belief set. Right. Here's what we're not for. The other was a kind of a culture of anti-intellectualism. And you hate to paint with too broad brushes, but what he saw by that in terms of anti-intellectualism was there was a reporting of an inability among church leaders and parents, as they talked about their church experience and their family upbringing, to answer critical questions. Yeah. When people would voice the kinds of doubts they were struggling with, they weren't met with good, thoughtful, thought-through answers. They were met with defensiveness, and their doubts were almost perceived as either a spirit of rebelliousness or somehow a lack of faith. And then the last was that overall, in general, their church Christian upbringing environment was seen as a very negative one. That Christians were generally critical and judgmental. They describe their church community. It was marked not by loving their neighbors, but by criticizing their neighbors. Yeah. And so those were kind of the aspects of fundamentalism.
What's interesting about those three aspects, though, Scott, as we're talking about them, is I'm thinking that what the teenagers are hearing or seeing on social media, or what the culture is talking about, put that up against those three areas. So the high emphasis on taboos. Well, that's having to follow what someone else is telling us to do, right? And when we look to culture, we're finding our own truth. And that's what a lot of these deconversion stories talked about. I could now find my own truth, right? Yep. And so that would be completely, opposite to taboos, being told, you have to do this, you have to believe this, and you have to think that. And the culture saying, here's all the culture saying, find your own truth, find out who you are, and all that kind of stuff. And so in a young person's mind, that's a battle. And they're hearing this from culture, and yet they go to church on Sunday, and they're you can't do this. Right. The last one, judgmental. What does the culture talk about? Social justice, when we talk about critical theory and all that kind of thing, right? And so they go to a church that's judgmental and coming down on people, and that. But then they hear from culture, you got to love everyone, and come around the oppressed person and help them. And so you could see those two extremes, and then when someone deconverts and goes to what culture believes, this freedom that now I can believe. Yeah, no, that's fascinating.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that this kind of experience absolutely runs against the grain of the ethos of our culture. Right. Openness, right? Inclusivity, acceptance, all those kinds of things. Now, the thing is, if you look at the gospel properly, right? Yes. Jesus is the poster child for accepting and loving and caring for people genuinely, not being judgmental, right? John chapter 3, verse 17, the Son did not come into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. Right. And so I think, we're going to probably get to that in a bit, but I think what it's starting to reveal is a lot of these stories are reflecting a caricature of Christianity that, frankly, when I listen to the stories and I hear them describing the Christian environment they came out of and the Christian faith that they're rejecting, I don't recognize it.
No.
I'm like, well, yeah, no wonder if that was your experience.
Yeah.
But I think it's noteworthy that those are the experiences that they are reporting,
Right.
rightly or wrongly.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, we do know in Christianity we are meant to discern between truth and error.
Sure.
We are meant to call sin, sin.
Mm-hmm.
And our culture doesn't like that.
No.
And so it's not a total, either or. It's complex.
Sure. Well, Christ talked about sin, called out
yeah.
sin,
Mm-hmm.
but he did it obviously in the perfect way, and that should be our example.
Right.
Yeah.
But he did confront people
Yep.
and bring the truth and judgment of God's truth to bear upon their sin.
Right.
We can't get around that.
No.
But in part it was the how and also the what of what he was pointing out. And so anyway, that's interesting, those aspects of fundamentalism.
Right. So the second theme you talked about was high Christian commitment, which my question would be, would that not keep people in the faith if they were highly committed?
Well, again, I suppose it depends on the context. Of course, these are contextual themes, right? They're describing, here's the context I grew up in. Mm-hmm. And high levels of commitment, of course, that can reveal one of two possibilities. I'm sure there's more than two. Mm-hmm. Either you're a highly committed Christian, devoted to, really the truth and the gospel and Christian ministry, mm-hmm. or you live in a church culture that legalistically elevates a particular level of outward commitment to activities. Mm-hmm. You're at service every Sunday. You're at prayer meeting every Wednesday night. You go on the missions trips. You're a part of youth group. Right. You do those things because that's what makes a good Christian, right? If that's the culture you grow up in, mm-hmm. then outwardly you could display a very high level of commitment,
right? While
inwardly you're dying because it's like these are legalistic rules, right. And it's that notion of this is what makes a true Christian. And again, because we're on radio or podcast, you can't see the quotes I'm using with my fingers.
He's using quotes. Trust me.
So I guess that's one thing but again, it's complicated. There's questions you would have to ask. But I think one of the things it does show, Shawn, however, is that in these deconversion stories, I think one thing we have to be careful of is that we're not dismissive.
Right.
Oh, the reason they left the faith is because they never belonged to us. That's what John says in 1 John, right? They went out from us because they were not part of us. That's a possibility, but that's not necessarily the case. Mm-hmm. That it could be that these were people who really were sincerely committed. I know it raises another question as far as, can a true Christian truly lose their faith?
Right.
Maybe that would be another episode.
Yeah, that's another podcast.
Yeah.
Good. And then the third theme that you talked about is problems with Christianity while being a Christian. Mm-hmm. And honestly, Scott, I have doubted my faith.
What? I'm outraged.
That's right. And as Matt was talking about, he doesn't have 100% of the answers. And so Christianity never says that you have to have, 100%.
No. No, and 100% certainty, that's a false holdover from from Cartesian, certainty. Mm-hmm. The only thing we can know for certain is,
right.
we don't gain knowledge that way. We can grow in certainty, but I don't think 100% certainty it's not attainable. It's not something we should try and achieve. It's an unrealistic level to reach in order to hold a belief with confidence. Mm-hmm. You're right, but yeah, we all have our doubts. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's not surprising then, something that Marriott noted. He said that 75% of former believers identified with a theological position, a social issue, or a lifestyle choice considered aberrant or out of keeping mm-hmm. by their conservative Christian communities.
Right.
Now, again, you can't just you have to ask more questions
sure.
about what that means exactly. What he goes on to say is, but that does raise the question. It raises the obvious question of whether some deconversions are more a matter of not liking true Christianity, right, and wanting it to be untrue, more than finding it untrue and then deconverting. So there's always an element of, is this a matter of the heart? Is someone having a problem with a position of biblical Christianity because they don't like it, because their heart is opposed to what God says is true and good?
Right.
Well, that's a real spiritual issue.
Sure.
But even if that is the case, I think we want to be careful not to necessarily dismiss someone just because they're wrestling.
Sure.
To accept and hold something that God has clearly revealed to be true. I think that's a part of the transformation that comes through the renewing of our minds. It's a process.
Sure.
So I think instructively, then it just gives us maybe some counsel to say we need to leave room in our conversations for people to voice dissent, without necessarily dismissing them out of hand.
Right.
But leaving the door open to, well, let's talk about this and see why it is we hold these views, assuming that these are sound biblical views,
right,
and not maybe unnecessary legalistic taboos that have been brought in as part of some kind of Christian subculture.
Right. And I think so critical also for parents with their children to be open to questioning from their kids.
Yeah.
To say to them, everything's on the table. Nothing is a taboo. Let's talk about that. Because I think part of the deconstruction or deconversion stories that I listened to was that notion of, as a child growing up, you could not question anything that the parents said.
Right.
And which, of course, made me think about my parenting and how I interact with my kids. And my hope and prayer is that I'm open to questions. My wife and I are, that it's an environment and it's a faith that is open to questioning. And then seeking that truth.
It was interesting to note he identified probably what were the most common problems that were cited, which when I read it, I was not surprised. The top three that these deconverts identified as the ones they had problems with while they were still Christians: positions on homosexuality and abortion. Probably the two leading moral issues in our culture today. The doctrine of hell, right, and then the goodness of God and the problem of evil. Well, legitimately, those are subjects that even real Christians, I'm using my scare quotes, right? Real Christians struggle with.
Sure they.
Right? Struggle to reconcile. Well, how can we take such a position? Because for a number of reasons, I mean, just legitimate questions, but also the degree to which the culture has shaped our sense of moral rightness. Well, how can we believe these things? But I think that just opens the door, rather than getting defensive and seeing that as a lack of faith. I think it just opens the door to saying, well, let's talk about that.
Let's search Scripture. And see what God has to say about those positions. Because
the gospel, rightly presented, the gospel speaks to all of them. And I don't want to say that we can resolve all the tensions, but the gospel addresses them all and answers them all. There is an answer to why these things, we hold them to be true, and that they are a necessary part of the gospel, of the good news. And, that's one of the things we try to do here at Prepared to Answer. One of the things I love about Matt's YouTube channel, Truth Snack, is that a lot of these questions are the ones that he works through in his own video ministry. Some of these common questions about doubt, or doubts about some of these hard positions or doctrines of the Bible. Rightly so. They're ones we need to help people work through.
Right. And we do that here as well on the Prepared to Answer podcast. We tackle some of these issues. And it's not to say that these three common problems are what will be the problems in the future.
True.
Right? And so that's part of our ministry as well, is that we're hoping to help those that are doubting or those that are questioning with the question of the day. right? These questions weren't the questions of the day 40 years ago,
Yeah.
right? And they won't be in 40 years from now.
Well, yes and no. The problem of evil has been around for a long time.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
I don't think that one's going away.
No.
But you're right. And as culture changes, who knows?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe, Scott, we could circle back to a question that we had at the start of this podcast, which is, are these deconversion stories new? Is this a new phenomenon that we are seeing?
Yeah. And my short answer to that question is no.
No. Okay.
No, this isn't anything new. Again, I think what's new is the genre of the story that's been popularized because so many quote unquote Christian celebrities have made very public tellings of their stories.
Right.
For one reason or another. And, again, we don't want to judge and try and presume to know the motives of someone's hearts. Mm-hmm. But it seems a little suspect when some are gaining financially because they've told a very public story that now has cast them in something of a more celebrity limelight, and they're actually, now they're being sought after for financial gain to tell their story or write their book or whatever. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think so. I think that's new.
Okay.
And as well as what's new is that because of the internet, it's like, divergent stories from around the world suddenly become not divergent. Mm-hmm. They're all on my Google search results, right? They're all right here in front of me, and it seems all of a sudden it seems like they're everywhere, right? Yes. Because Google found all of them at once for me. Right. And I think that might be new. But it's not new ultimately, even when we look back to the very earliest disciples. Yeah. And an example that's often used is the example of Paul and Demas. And Demas was a follower, he was a disciple of Paul, one of Paul's fellow workers. In Colossians chapter 4 and Philemon chapter 1, we see Demas appear a couple of times listed among Paul's companions. Right. Colossians 4:14, Paul signs off saying, greetings from our dear friend Luke, Luke the doctor who wrote Luke's gospel in the book of Acts. Yep. Luke the historian, the doctor, he says, and Demas send their greetings. Mm-hmm. Right. In Philemon 1, he said, send greetings, and I send greetings, and so do Mark. That's John Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and again, Luke, my fellow workers. Right. So, here's the picture of Paul, right, doing missionary journeys, and he had a group of friends, a group of co-workers who traveled with him, and Demas was among his number for about 5 years.
And when I think about that, I'm thinking Paul is doing this ministry, and these fellow workers are with him. Who is not going to fall away? Those that are with Paul. I mean, my faith is strengthened joining Prepared to Answer because I'm with Scott.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say. I hope that's always true.
Scott is not Paul, though his middle name is Paul. So I think back to Scripture and go, if these men were with Paul, these are the guys that are not falling away. Right.
And so, to the uncertainty about the kind of the present day caricatures, if anyone was witnessing true biblical Christianity, lived out and proclaimed, it was Demas. Right. Yeah. But in 2 Timothy 4, about 5 years after Paul writes Colossians and Philemon, which would have been during his first missionary journey, maybe first or second, he writes to Timothy from prison in Rome. Mm-hmm. He says, do your best to come to me quickly. He says, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica. He says, only Luke is left with me. Yeah. So he's calling to Timothy. He's saying, look, I'm in prison. I'm facing execution. I'm not doing so great. I need some encouragement. I need some support. Yeah. Come to me quickly. Luke's the only one here who can take care of me. It's too much of a burden for him. And so he wants Timothy to come. But Demas, and Paul says, because he loved this world, he's deserted me. So you might say we have here the first deconversion story.
Right. Why would it be included in Scripture? Right. So you think of a deconversion story as a downer, like a discouragement. Mm-hmm. Yet Paul's included it, and the Holy Spirit's included it in Scripture.
Well, that's a really good question, Shawn. I think there's two things going on in answering it. Mm-hmm. One is, why did Paul include it?
Right.
And I think probably the most logical and I think consistent answer to that question is because Paul is writing a letter. Right? We remember the dual nature of biblical authorship, the divine and human cooperation.
Right.
So that it's not this, Paul's not dictating what God's telling him to write.
Right.
In this case, Paul's pouring out his heart here. I'm in prison. Right. Timothy, he's writing this, kind of this, maybe even struggling with depression at this point.
Sure.
I'm all on my own, Timothy. Luke's the only one.
Right.
And I need encouragement. I need help. Would you come help me?
Yeah.
Because I'm stuck here in Rome and I'm going to the executioner soon.
Yeah.
So in one sense, this is very human. And so, maybe, Paul's a human being. That Demas, he left me.
Right.
He clearly loved the world more than he loved the Lord.
Yeah.
And so he left me. He's gone to Thessalonica. Why else would he go to Thessalonica?
Yeah.
And I think that in his humanness, I think Paul is maybe, he may be saying, more than he can,
right.
more than he knows.
Sure.
Who knows what was motivating Demas? Again, Paul's in prison in Rome. Mm-hmm. The Romans are now persecuting Christians. Mm-hmm. Demas, who we don't know his story. He could have been frightened. Yeah. Maybe he was afraid for his life and he lost courage.
Yeah.
And so he fled.
Sure.
Right? In a moment of weakness. Who knows?
Right.
Why the Holy Spirit decided to include it, I think there's a good reason. I think there's probably a number of reasons. Mm-hmm. One, probably to simply reaffirm the historical realness of the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yep.
This isn't some kind of a
fairy tale.
This isn't like Homer's Odyssey, right? This poetic, fanciful kind of imaginatory story.
Yeah.
This is real stuff. And so I think throughout the New Testament, we see example after example, especially in Paul's letters, of the realness of these Christians' lives being displayed in their writing. Yeah. So I think the Spirit does that for a reason. The second thing, though, is I think it's instructive. And I think what's instructive here, and I think instructive for us when talking about this, subject of deconversion, and our reaction, our concern, and our response, is that it's not the final word. Right. What's interesting here is, again, and back in Philemon chapter 1, verse 24, Paul includes Demas, but he also includes Mark. Mm-hmm. And in Acts chapter 15, Mark is also mentioned. Actually, there's this dispute between Paul and Barnabas. This is during when they're about to start their second missionary journey back to Asia Minor, back to visit the churches he planted on the first one. And Paul and Barnabas get into a sharp disagreement because Barnabas wants to take John Mark. And Paul says no, because John Mark deserted them back in Pamphylia. Right. Apparently there was some event in Pamphylia where John Mark got cold feet and left them.
Right.
High and dry, whatever. He bugged out.
Yes. Right.
And so Paul was like, no, John Mark deserted us, right?
Yeah.
And yet here we have back to 2 Timothy. Mm-hmm. Paul's writing about Demas. Demas has deserted me. He loved the world more, right? But then he says, this is one verse later, he says, only Luke is with me. Then he says, get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So between Philemon and Colossians, Mark is on Paul's good side.
Yes.
First journey around.
Yeah.
Then Mark deserts him,
yep.
right? And Paul wants nothing to do with him because he deserted them.
Yep.
But now by the time he's back in Rome, writing to Timothy,
yeah.
Mark is back in his good books.
Yeah.
Mark has redeemed himself and shown his faithfulness and shown his usefulness to Paul. And so I think what's instructive there is that we're not given the final word on Demas.
No.
We don't know what happened to him.
No.
Who knows?
No.
And I think that's instructive because with all of these deconversion stories, we don't have the final word on that.
Right.
The jury's not out yet.
Right. Exactly.
Right? There's always hope.
There is. Yeah.
So I don't know what's happening exactly sociologically because of all this deconversion phenomenon.
But it's not new.
It's not new, and it doesn't dishearten me. I don't want to say it's not discouraging. It is disheartening. It's hurtful. It's hard to hear.
Sure.
But we also don't know what's going on.
Right.
When you look at some of the research results that Marriott points out, it could be that what people are deconverting from is not biblical Christianity,
Right.
but some kind of, false caricature of some Christian subculture.
Right.
There have been things that have been burdened onto biblical Christianity that don't belong there, and now it's taken on a shape that's not true biblical faith. These extra baggages that become a burden to people. What's interesting, Shawn, is how many of these deconversion stories, and Marriott points this out, and even in reading them, it's so consistent in other people I've read and written and who've written about it as well, is that almost all of these deconversion stories end with people declaring how free they feel
Right.
after they've escaped.
Right.
Now, it could be because they don't like biblical Christianity, they don't want it to be true, and they want to go and do their own thing. But it could also be because what they were experiencing wasn't real Christian faith, but some kind of oppressive, heavy, burdened, legalistic caricature.
Sure.
Right? And
So this could be a good thing.
So if that's the case, escaping it is a good thing.
But then also bringing it to light.
Bringing it to light and perhaps forcing the church to take a good, long, hard look at what we are presenting as true biblical faith.
Right.
And what true biblical Christian community ought to look like. That it ought not look oppressive or harsh or judgmental, but it ought to look, Jesus said, come to me, all you who are heavy laden and burdened. My yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Yep.
So it shouldn't be oppressive to be a Christian.
No.
If people are feeling that way, we ought to ask some long and hard questions.
Yeah. I think we'll wrap it up there. Scott, what a great note, though, to end on with Mark. That Acts 15 wasn't the end of Mark's could-be deconversion story, him deserting Paul.
Right.
But actually, the end was Paul having Mark come or wanting him to come back.
Yeah.
And so throughout all of these deconversion stories, this isn't necessarily the end. This isn't the final word.
No. In fact, it could be the beginning.
Exactly. Right. Which is encouraging.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you, Scott, and I want to thank our listeners. As we talked about those issues that people may be struggling with, we'd encourage you to go to the Prepared to Answer website, preparedtoanswer.org, or to Truth Snack's YouTube page, which you can find by just typing in Truth Snack, for some of the help with those questions that you may be struggling with or may be doubting. If you do have a question, we'd also encourage you to email us at info@preparedtoanswer.org as well. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Shawn.
God bless.
See you next time. This podcast has been a ministry of Prepared to Answer. Our mission at Prepared to Answer is to help prepare, equip, and encourage the Church of Jesus Christ to grow in confidence of faith by teaching Christians to think like Jesus. To access more resources to help you begin understanding life and the world around you with the mind of Jesus, visit our website at www.preparedtoanswer.org. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Prepared to Answer. Or contact us directly by email at info@preparedtoanswer.org. May the Lord bless and keep you.